People hear the government say, the economy's fine, or, unemployment's near an all-time low, which actually statistically is true. And they kind of nod and go, yeah, it's all good. And then reality is the stuff that hits you in the head like a two by four. The propaganda is positive. We can talk about that in a little more detail. The reality is harsh, and reality wins. There's a very good book on this by Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize winning economist at Yale University. I'm not a huge fan of your garden variety PhD economists, but there are some good ones out there, and he's one of them. He wrote a book about, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, called Narrative Economics. He said, yeah, we got all the models and Phillips curve and wealth effect and various quantity theory money, and some have a place, some are more valuable than others. But don't underestimate the power of a narrative. A narrative is a story. It's basically it's a fancy name for a story, but a story that persists, that grows. And interestingly, in epidemiology, of course, we've just come through a pandemic. There's a model called the SEIR model that stands for susceptible. Are you susceptible to a virus? E for exposed. Are you exposed to it? I, are you infected? Did you get it? And R, did you recover? The difference between I and R are people who died. But it's a model, and it's mathematically based, and it's empirically validated of how viruses spread exponentially. And you can also use it to forecast how a virus is going to go. Well, what Shiller did, he took that model, moved it over to economics, and took a narrative kind of like a virus, not in a negative sense, but just as something that spreads. And it can be very powerful, and then eventually may die out or reverse, but it can be powerful in the meantime. That much I knew, but what I learned from the book that I hadn't really thought about is that narratives don't have to be true. They can be true, and they can be very powerful, but a narrative can be false and still be powerful. If it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes the reality to some extent, even if it's based on false premises. He gives an example during the Great Depression. The Great Depression really was two technical recessions, but there was a period from 1929 to 1933, election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then there was another period from 1933 to 1937. The 37 and 1940 part we leave aside for this purpose. But during the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative, but it's the worst possible economic advice, because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending that kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Now, when FDR came along, was elected in 1933, became president in 1934, the psychology turned 180 degrees, and all of a sudden, the Democratic campaign song was "Happy Days Are Here Again," and FDR seemed to solve the banking crisis and so forth. And all of a sudden, it became okay to spend money. Well, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1934 to 1936, those were some of the strongest years ever for the stock market. And unemployment did come down a lot. Now, the problem is it came down from like 25% to 15%. Well, 15% is still, painfully high, but it was a big move in the right direction. So he describes how the narrative flipped from don't spend money, it's poor form, to, yeah, go spend money and help the economy. None of that is taught in business school. It's not taught in economics. It can be modeled using this epidemiology model, but it doesn't fit into any of the standard macroeconomic models, but it's powerful stuff. And so today what's going on is that the White House is trying to push a narrative, and they're failing badly. But they'll say, if you listen to the deliberations among White House officials, some of the stuff leaks to the press, and I know some of these people, it's like the economy's great, unemployment's really low. We've created all these jobs since the pandemic, but we're doing a really bad job of messaging. The point is, inside the White House, they're frustrated that the positive economic story is not getting out. The correct analysis is that there is no positive economic story. The economy is in terrible shape. The problem is not the messaging, it's the message. And this is why I say the propaganda from the White House that things are great is at odds with the reality, which is things are not great. Let me give you some specific data points, because as I say, I don't like to make statements like this without backing it up. Number one, the inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything was great until February 27th, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up. All right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, transitory, transitory. And then finally, I think Jay Powell was testifying before Congress. He said, it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. So it predates the war, number one. Number two, energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine, it's because the U.S. counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president, and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. And then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada. Then ended new leasing, oil and gas exploration leasing on federal lands, handicapped the fracking industry, took a number of other steps using environmental tools, climate alarm, government subsidies, et cetera, to basically, to the extent possible, shut down the U.S. energy industry as much as possible. Now, you can't shut down completely, of course, but everything happens at the margin. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really, from $40 to $120 in under a year, which is comparable to what happened in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. And then Biden wakes up and says, guess we need more oil. And he wants to reopen leasing. I said they shut it down. They did, but he wants to reopen it. He's begging Saudi Arabia to pump more. Saudi Arabia is kind of not returning his phone calls. He's begging Venezuela to pump more. Oh, great. The greatest pariah dictator in the Western Hemisphere, and we're begging him for oil. So why don't we drill our own oil? Because we were a net exporter up until 2021, and then Biden came in and we lost that edge and became a net importer, including recently buying oil from Russia. They curtailed that for political reasons, but that's kind of where we got to. So you wonder why the price of energy is going up. In other words, this damage was self-inflicted, but don't be misled by the headlines, because they're, again, this narrative, but they're not actually doing it. So the point being, the price increase and the inflation in the US has very little to do with Putin, and everything to do with the U.S. handicapping its own energy industry, begging dictators for oil, and the influence of the climate alarmists. And by the way, that whole crowd want higher gas prices. They want gas to be $7, $8, $9 a gallon, because they expect that will accelerate the transfer to electric vehicles and make the electric vehicle more attractive relative to the internal combustion engine. Now, that's another fantasy. It won't happen. We don't have time to go through all the physics of it, and output of energy by weight, gasoline compared to batteries, and the pollution of batteries, and the fact that we don't have the charging stations. And even if we did, where's that electricity coming from? Oh, coal. It will never happen. But meanwhile, they're destroying the U.S. economy in pursuit of an ideological point that will never actually happen. Another example of propaganda versus reality. Narratives are powerful, but reality is more powerful.